Glasnost is a Russian term that roughly translates to openness and transparency. It is a word closely associated with the Soviet reforms of the late 1980s. In the face of economic stagnation, public hostility, and a catastrophic war and subsequent withdrawal from Afghanistan, Soviet chairman Mikhail Gorbachev set out on a series of reforms under the umbrella of perestroika to open up the Iron Curtain, if only a bit. Transparency was brought into the Soviet government. Critical voices among the population were given a platform, and the Western world, along with its culture, were allowed to seep into the East. There would be Pizza Hut, there would be Osborne, and soon enough, there would be college football. We begin sometime around 1988, in a meeting between Sovintersport, a division of the Soviet Ministry of Sports and Physical Culture, and Raycom, a broadcasting company out of Charlotte, North Carolina. The idea of an international exhibition game was not necessarily new. The 1988 season would see the first of many games in Ireland between Boston College and Army, and the annual Mirage Bowl in Japan had been an end-of-year fixture since 1977. But this would be something entirely different. It would be the first American football game in a communist country. Not just an attempt to grow international intrigue for the sport, but a symbol of peace in a continent of cold hostility. The game would be televised across the Warsaw Pact and Western Bloc alike, and was set to play on Moscow's Dynamo Stadium, the host of the 1980 Olympics America boycotted a mere 8 years prior. All that was left, it seemed, was to choose teams. Initially, most every major team in the nation wanted a chance to play in the history books. Florida's Big Three, Texas, Alabama, Penn State, the LA schools, Wisconsin, to name a few. But there was a problem. Despite the extremely short notice, the NCAA stood firm on its limit of 11 games a season. If a team wanted to make the historic journey to the USSR, they'd have to cut a game. Some, like Miami, balked at the prospect of a tough game across the globe, which, considering their previous experience with a tough international game, makes sense. Others, like Florida, couldn't get out of their agreements with their scheduled out-of-conference opponents, and there was a problem with compensation. Home games make a ton of money for the home team, especially for big-name programs, and the opportunity to drop one of these lucrative home games to play in Russia wasn't necessarily appealing. Raycom would sweeten the pot with $300,000 to make up for the lost revenue, but it simply wasn't enough for many. Finally, the game would be televised on ABC, which was in conflict with the SEC's exclusive television rights with TBS, which further decreased the pool of available teams. By the end of the selection process, only 2 programs remained. USC was able to get off their game with Kansas, and Illinois accepted the $300,000 compensation. Like that, the Glasnost Bowl had its competitors. USC was already well-traveled, having played Oregon 3 years prior in Japan, but for Illinois, this was a prime opportunity to play their first game abroad. The excitement in the local press was palpable. The Fighting Illini were not known for much, being historically a pretty middle-of-the-pack Big Ten school. But here, they'd have the chance at putting their name in the history books. A pioneer. They even made special Illinois jerseys for Reagan, Gorbachev, and Vice President Bush Sr. to be distributed in Moscow. USC, on the other hand, had more domestic concerns. The Trojans finished the 1988 season a single game away from a chance at a national title. They were heading into 1989 with aspirations for greatness. All the better if they could make history on the way. With the team set, Raycom and Sovintersport's attention shifted to the logistics, which were a complete clusterfuck. First was the field itself, being made for soccer, needed to be extended 10 extra yards. Dynamo also needed to be outfitted with goalposts, which the Soviets, shockingly, did not have. Instead, they needed to be shipped in from Finland. Everything needed to be shipped in, as a matter of fact. Ice machines to treat any injuries, chefs for the teams, and an estimated ton of food per team. The equipment, the AstroTurf, the players of course, but also USC's marching band and cheerleaders, both coaching staffs, and 14 hand-picked Illinois graduates, all on a Boeing 747. The Trojans at least had the restraint to source a local horse to fill in for Traveler. Then there was the locker rooms, big enough for a 16-person soccer team, but cramped for a 75-person American football team. There were also no communications between the upper booths and the field. Then, there was the issue that the Soviet population, again shockingly, did not know what football was or how it was played, with some seemingly having the perspective that it was a Romanesque blood sport, which, granted the Trojans' home stadium stand, doesn't sound like the worst guess in the world. Then there was the problem of accommodating not just each team and their staffs, not only the Soviets in attendance, but the roughly 7,000 fans of both teams planned to attend the event. For the low price of $2,595 a fan, $6,439 today. Which, by the way, is still around $2,000 less than the average Super Bowl ticket. It's this last problem that would cause the most issues. The rooms were cramped and filthy. USC had its own problems with accommodation in their Mirage Bowl, but this was an entirely new level of bad. There wasn't a shot either team or the fans would be content. There also weren't enough rooms for everyone, and when organizers on the American end reached out to their Soviet counterparts, there was only static. Ironically, the Openness Bowl would end because of a lack of openness. The final nail in the coffin would come when Raycom found itself in a legal battle with the event's American promoters, and the Glasnost Bowl was officially canned. Thankfully, a contingency was drafted up early in the planning process in the event the Cold War heated up again, and the matchup was returned to American soil, with the Trojans hosting the Fighting Illini for their season opener. Despite initial disappointments, especially from the Illinois side, the sourness disappeared in the face of a California vacation. Before Disney, however, both would play the Glasnost Bowl that could have been. The game itself was a defensive slugfest, with Illinois, despite having zero preseason expectations, putting up a respectable effort against number 5 USC. While both teams had dominant defenses, USC's was far better at limiting the ground game, holding their opponents to 61.5 rushing yards per game, an advantage circumvented by Illinois' pass-first offensive scheme. Down by 13 late into the game, Illinois would need to take full advantage of the Trojan defense's Achilles heel, and a little bit of magic. The Illinois defense would hold, and against all odds, they'd win out 14-13. Neither would be too bad off, however, with USC going on to win the Pac-10 in the 1990 Rose Bowl, while Illinois would finish one game short of winning the Big Ten, both finishing in the top 10. In Russia, however, things were changing. 2 months off from when the Glasnost Bowl was to be played, the Berlin Wall would fall, the beginning of the end for the Soviet Union and the Cold War as a whole. Before then, though, football would find itself in Russia once more.
Stampeders are home now. Most of us who were gone the last 2 weeks are even speaking semi-decent English again. But it's a fairly safe bet that none of the 90 high school graduates who've now been behind the Iron Curtain will ever be the same.
Before the '89 season, but before the Glasnost Bowl's death, a group of Oklahoma football players, freshly graduated from high school, would take on the mantle of American football's pioneers into the Eastern Bloc, raising money through fundraisers to make the trip out to the USSR themselves. They'd begin in Moscow, the site of the planned bowl that started everything, then to Leningrad, and finally to Tallinn in the Soviet Republic of Estonia. There were 90 players, separated into the boomers and stars, and for the first time in history, played American football on Russian soil. The reception from the Russian people were mixed. Most enjoyed the spectacle despite knowing little of the sport itself. According to the players, the younger people seemed to be more welcoming than the older attendees, but nevertheless, the trip would make enough of an impact to lead to the first Soviet-American football team, the Moscow Bears, to be established later that year. In 1914, as the First World War engulfed Western Europe, for a single day the guns went silent. Men from both sides met in peace and played. While possibly more myth than reality, the idea of individuals from both sides of one of humanity's bloodiest wars coming together to play some form of soccer with one another is one that remains to this day. The Cold War never became the apocalyptic hellscape the two world wars would delve into. Yet here, in yet another global conflict between power blocks built to engulf the individual, they met in peace and played. The Glasnost Bowl, at least in its original incarnation, was a complete failure, a logistical nightmare for all involved, and was much too ambitious to pull off. Yet the game arrived all the same, a moment of peace in an era of conflict.